In a locked congressional chamber, thick with tension, Jasmine Crockett steps in alone, clutching one red envelope and 19 years of buried screams. At the far end, Donald Trump sits smug and untouchable, arms folded like a king above the law. But when Jasmine looks him dead in the eye and says, "I'm about to place one truth on this table," the room doesn't just freeze, it trembles. One girl vanished, one father never named. What happens when forensic science erupts in 47 seconds and the man who once ruled everything is cornered by DNA? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The door clicked shut behind her. No cameras, no reporters, no noise except the dull hum of fluorescent lights and the rustle of suits shifting in leather chairs. Jasmine Crockett stepped into the hearing room like she owned the storm coming. In her right hand, a red envelope, thick, sharp-cornered, and sealed. Her heels struck the floor like gunshots. The room was full of eyes, men in power, mostly white, mostly smirking. On the far end, Donald Trump sat reclined, arms folded, mouth twisted into a smug grin. "Look who they let in," he muttered to the man beside him. Laughter, quiet, bitter, rippled down his row. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't break stride. She walked straight to the table in the center, the envelope still in her grip. She didn't bother sitting. Every motion was deliberate, like each second was carved in steel. Trump stared her down, lips twitching with contempt. His voice cut across the silence. "More fiction, Jasmine?" Another chuckle behind him. Jasmine placed the envelope on the table, one hand still resting on top. Her gaze locked forward, dead calm. Then with a voice that didn't shake once, she said, "I'm not here for your games. I'm here to put one truth on this table, one no man in this room can run from." The air cracked. Trump's face stiffened. His smile slipped, but just enough. The other members stopped moving. Even the arrogant ones leaned in. Jasmine finally sat. No words, no posturing, just silence and a red envelope like a loaded weapon between them. The war hadn't started, but the room could already feel who was going to lose. The moment hung like a blade in the air, sharp and waiting. Jasmine didn't move quickly. She moved like someone who knew exactly how much silence to use as a weapon. She reached into the red envelope and pulled out a single sheet, no thicker than breath, but heavy enough to change the trajectory of the room. She held it with precision, between two fingers, like it might burn through the table if set down too soon. The fluorescent lights caught the official seal in the top corner, Department of Forensic Evidence, Washington, D.C., and for the first time, the mockery in the room dimmed. Jasmine let them look. Let them wonder. Then she spoke, voice calm and controlled, each word landing with the weight of a gavel. "This is a DNA analysis completed last month using enhanced sequencing technology." The room shifted, shoulders tensed, a pen dropped somewhere behind her. "The original biological material," she continued, "came from a 2003 evidence file. The case involved a missing 13-year-old girl, last seen leaving a party at Mar-a-Lago. Her name was withheld then and will remain protected today." The temperature in the room didn't drop, it vanished. A few members leaned forward in their seats, jaws clenched, eyes locked on the document like it might explode. Trump's smirk hadn't fully disappeared, but something behind his eyes flickered recognition. Maybe. Regret, never. Jasmine turned her head slowly, just enough to glance toward him, then back to the paper like he wasn't worth her full attention. The results show a 99.98% genetic match with a living male subject, one who has held a senior government office and is seated in this room. What followed wasn't an eruption, it was disintegration. Order crumbled in real time. One committee member slammed his binder shut. Another barked, "What the hell is this?" A third stood and demanded immediate adjournment. "This is inappropriate, irrelevant, out of order," rang out from the back of the chamber like a chorus of panic. Trump's aide fumbled through his notes, whispering frantically into the ear of legal counsel. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink. Her fingers lowered the sheet onto the table, deliberate and final, like she was lowering a flag over a battlefield. "This is the authorization," she said, cutting through the chaos. "The victim's mother signed it herself." That line didn't just land, it detonated. Trump turned red, not with rage, but with something harder to define. Cornered pride, ancient ego, panic pretending to be indignation. Bullshit. Absolute bullshit, he muttered to his counsel, voice tighter now, no longer playing to the room. His right hand began tapping the table, fast and uneven, the rhythm of a man who just realized the rules had changed, and he wasn't holding the dice anymore. The laughter was gone. The arrogance cracked. The envelope lay empty on the wood. The page lay still beside it. And in that moment, no one could hear anything except the quiet breath of Jasmine Crockett, the only person in the room who had planned for this day down to the second. The room had gone still, but not quiet. Beneath the silence was tension, thick as smoke, clinging to every breath. Eyes darted between the document Jasmine had just laid flat and the man it now hovered over like a loaded trap. But Jasmine wasn't done. She reached once more into her briefcase, this time slower, like she knew this was the moment the room would remember not for the data, but for the question. Her fingers pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, perfectly white, folded once down the middle. No stamps, no signatures, just one line in the center, black ink, no emotion. She didn't raise it in the air. She didn't speak over anyone. She simply slid it forward, turning it so Trump could read it clearly, her hand never shaking once. On the page, "Would you be willing to provide a sample to clear your name?" There was a beat of silence. Then Trump exploded into laughter, loud, forced, jagged. It echoed off the chamber walls like something rehearsed too many times. He leaned back in his chair, mouth wide, shoulders shaking, trying to look amused but sounding almost manic. "I don't need to prove anything," he said, voice sharp and defiant, "to anyone." His grin returned, but it was hollow now. His eyes weren't smiling, and the corner of his mouth twitched too quickly. His fingers tapped the desk faster than before, uneven, panicked beneath the performance. Across the room, nobody laughed with him. The committee members froze, not knowing whether to act, speak, or wait. The document lay untouched, unchallenged. It was one of those moments that should have felt like victory, a clean, scientific trap set by justice itself. But the air was suddenly colder. Jasmine had drawn the blade, and he had laughed in its face. And somehow, that laughter landed heavier than denial. This wasn't the villain twisting facts or crying innocence. This was him refusing the question entirely. Not because it wasn't valid, but because he knew he didn't have to answer. And that more than anything was what made the silence, after so devastating. The truth sat there, complete and unshakable, and power once again walked around it untouched. What should have been a reckoning felt like a reminder. Even facts can drown under the weight of arrogance. And sometimes justice doesn't end in screams, it ends in a smirk. The air had thinned. After Trump's arrogant refusal to submit a DNA sample, the room was teetering between disbelief and dread, like standing on cracked ice, waiting for it to give. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She reached once more into the red envelope, now clearly deeper than anyone expected. This time her hand emerged with an older document, thick, stamped, folded with age. She held it with quiet finality, and when she unfolded it on the desk, the room tilted again, not from noise, but from what they saw. A scanned medical report from 2002, the header blurred with time but unmistakably official. She looked directly at the committee chair. "This is a copy of an internal medical report from 2002, she said, her voice now steadier, colder like ice cutting across steel. "The patient's initials are LC. She was 13 when she was found disoriented outside a gas station in Palm Beach, hours after leaving a party at Mar-a-Lago." No one blinked. In her statement to police, she described being picked up by a very rich man, blonde hair, big voice, big car. She said he drove a black SUV. That SUV, Jasmine added, holding up a printed vehicle registration, was traced to a shell company linked to Mar-a-Lago's private logistics account. One senator leaned forward. Another uncapped his pen without realizing. Jasmine kept going. The report was signed by the investigating officer, who marked the file as open, suspect not identified. 4 days later, the officer was reassigned. The file was sealed and marked inactive. It was never followed up again. Then, without pause, she produced a second document, a traffic cam still. Grainy, washed out, but unmistakable. This is footage from April 2002, collected from a Department of Transportation camera, 2 blocks from the gas station where LC was recovered. She placed it beside the report. A black SUV, driver's side window half down. The head, though slightly turned, bore a silhouette so specific it needed no label. Unmistakable blonde hair, thick neck, square shoulders. She didn't need to name him. Everyone's eyes went to the same place: Trump, now fuming, his face flushing a deeper shade by the second. Jasmine's voice didn't rise. We ran this through forensic enhancement software. The match came back at 89% probability to a known public figure. Trump slammed his hand on the desk. This is fabricated, defamatory trash. His voice ricocheted off the chamber walls like a gunshot fired too late. You're peddling lies from 20 years ago. Everyone here knows it. But no one echoed him. Not this time. The laughter from earlier was gone. Even the most partisan members sat in tight silence, hands frozen mid-note, eyes refusing to meet hers or his. The room had shifted again, this time from ridicule to recognition. This was no longer a performance. The documents, the registration, the footage, they were too specific, too cold, too real. And still, justice hesitated. The case had no living voice, no sworn statement in the present, no finger pointed across the room. Just paper, signatures, pixels, dates, and silence longer, heavier, more damning than any accusation. It was the silence of a system that had paused too many times when a little girl said, "A rich man took me." It was the silence of 20 years rotting inside a locked file. And though Jasmine had cracked it open with facts, logic, and steel, the final blow still waited for a voice the room had not yet heard. That silence was louder than Trump's outburst, and somehow far more terrifying. But just when the weight of the evidence seemed undeniable, the room snapped like power refusing to die quietly. From the right side of the chamber, Representative Paul Gaines, Trump's most loyal mouthpiece, leaned forward, voice loud, nasal, meant for spectacle, not substance. You are dragging the name of a president through the mud with what old stories from broken girls? The room erupted in cruel laughter, sharp, dismissive, full of the arrogance that comes from decades of unchecked privilege. Several committee members smirked, shook their heads, murmured agreement under their breath. Jasmine barely got another word out before she was interrupted twice. Let her finish, one congresswoman attempted to say, but her voice was drowned by overlapping objections, snickers, and low murmurs of disdain. Trump didn't say a word until he did. His voice sliced through the noise with cold confidence. You don't belong here, Crockett. This isn't your courtroom. The room went still again, but this time, not out of respect, out of anticipation. Jasmine didn't speak, not right away. She let the silence throb, let it tighten around every throat like a vice. 10 full seconds passed uncomfortable, unbroken. Then she turned, calm and composed, and said with quiet force, I'm not here to belong. I'm here to make sure someone else finally does. The laughter stopped. No one moved. The men who just laughed suddenly couldn't look at her. The power shifted not loudly but completely. In that single breath, she didn't just reclaim the floor, she redefined it. She wasn't just standing for the girls in the reports. She was standing with them. Her poise wasn't strategy, it was survival, turned into weapon. And in that instant, the audience, whoever they were, wherever they sat, felt something ignite. The rage that came from hearing her name dragged through filth, the heartbreak of watching her grace be ridiculed, and the awe of seeing her rise above it, untouched. Disgust turned into fire, doubt turned into belief, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a room full of men realizing they no longer controlled what happened next. The silence that followed Jasmine's last words wasn't just quiet, it was hollow, stretching long and uneasy, like the air itself refused to move. But she wasn't finished, not yet. Her eyes drifted toward the rear of the chamber, and with a single subtle nod, she set the final act in motion. No announcement, no warning, just that nod, sharp, precise, deliberate. The kind of gesture that says you may enter the fire now. The chamber doors opened, slowly, And with them came a shift so palpable, it felt like gravity had changed. A young woman stepped into the room, no press escort, no handlers, no introductions. She looked barely in her 20s, maybe 22 at most, and yet there was a gravity around her that silenced even the chairs beneath the committee members. Her clothes were modest, gray blouse, worn jeans, flat scuffed at the edges. Nothing remarkable except the photograph in her hand, yellowed and creased like it had been carried in wallets and journals for years. She didn't look around. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight down the center aisle, her footsteps soft but deafening against the hard floor. No one knew who she was. Not yet, but everyone knew she mattered. She stopped next to Jasmine without looking at her, without asking permission. Her eyes were locked forward, already aimed at the man who hadn't stopped watching her since she entered. Donald Trump sat straighter now, no longer lounging, no longer smug. His jaw was tight, expression unreadable, but his right hand had gripped the edge of the table so firmly his knuckles had turned white. Then the woman spoke soft, but steady. Her voice didn't tremble. "My name is Alina Cortez. I was born in 2003. I never knew who my father was. Until now." The chamber didn't react right away. It couldn't. There was a beat, maybe two, where the silence turned liquid, seeping into the floor, climbing the walls. Then it shattered. Papers stopped rustling. Pens froze mid-stroke. The committee chair leaned forward, his mouth slightly parted like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Staffers glanced at one another, wide-eyed and blinking in disbelief. And still, Trump didn't speak. His body stilled, but his eyes sharp and focused like a man watching a threat he thought he'd buried years ago now walk into the light. Jasmine stood motionless beside Alina. She didn't introduce her, didn't explain her presence. She simply nodded once, confirming what the room already feared was true. "We verified everything, from time, place, to blood." She said it gently, like a confession, but it struck like a verdict. All the earlier objections, the outbursts, the laughter, they vanished. Nothing about this moment could be spun as political. Nothing here could be brushed off as hearsay. This was a living person, a young woman standing feet away from the man whose name had appeared again and again in sealed files and whispered accusations. This wasn't evidence. This was consequence. Alina stepped forward, just one pace. Her hand tightened slightly on the photo. Her chin lifted. Then for the first time, she locked eyes with Trump, not with hatred, not with fear, but with a kind of weary certainty that only someone who had been denied answers her whole life could carry. "I don't need the test," she said. "I know he's the father." 7 words. And with them, 47 seconds passed from the moment she entered to the second they landed like thunder against the marble walls. No one moved. No one could. Trump didn't laugh. His usual sneer, that ever-present mask of defiance, was gone, replaced with a look not of guilt, but of calculation, like he was trying to process how fast the room had turned on him without a single scream. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. This wasn't a legal revelation. It was a human one. And somehow it felt louder than any courtroom testimony, more damning than any document Jasmine could have placed on the table. Because in those 47 seconds, every person in that chamber witnessed the collision between privilege and truth, between a man who spent decades untouchable and a girl who had spent 2 decades invisible. No camera flashed, no gavel slammed, but the emotional impact was seismic. Staffers sat frozen, blinking back shock. Some committee members shifted awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. Trump's allies glanced down at their notes, suddenly busy with things that no longer mattered. And Jasmine said nothing. Her work for that moment was done. She had opened the door, and the truth walked in on its own. The words had been spoken, and they couldn't be undone. Alina's final sentence still hung in the room like smoke from a gunshot, the kind that doesn't echo but settles deep in the chest. Trump didn't flinch. He didn't defend. He simply turned toward his lawyer, leaned in, and began whispering with urgency. His mouth moved fast, like he was grasping for lifelines in a language made of excuses. But no voice came back. The lawyer nodded once, scribbled something onto a notepad, then lowered his eyes. There was no strategy left to deploy. No counterattack rehearsed for this moment. Around them, the once defiant row of Republican allies had gone still. One reached for his water but couldn't lift the glass without rattling it. Another Senator Claiborne stood up without a word and left the room, his footsteps brisk but deliberate. Within seconds, two more followed, heads down, like soldiers retreating from a field they knew they'd already lost. And still, Jasmine said nothing. She stood beside Alina, her hands calm, her face unreadable, but her eyes held the kind of clarity only born from pain, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be felt. Then finally she stepped forward one measured pace and spoke, her voice low but unshakable. She doesn't want compensation. She doesn't want revenge. She only wanted to know the truth. And now, she does. The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They landed like the last nail in a coffin, quiet, final, undeniable. Across the room, the committee members froze mid-note. The ones who had laughed earlier now sat motionless, their faces emptied of color, their pens resting silently beside untouched paper. And then nothing. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the hum of the air system above. The silence was deafening in its judgment, more punishing than any accusation could have been. Near the corner, the interpreter, who had remained professional for hours, put down her pen. She blinked, swallowed, and wiped a tear with the back of her hand before quickly turning away. It wasn't translation anymore. It was witnessing. No one needed her to repeat Jasmine's words in another language. Truth had spoken in a voice every human soul could understand. Jasmine didn't linger. She didn't wait to be thanked, didn't scan the room for approval. She turned quietly toward the exit. Her heels, which had been drowned out by voices all day, now echoed clean and sharp on the polished stone floor. Each step away from the table felt like the close of a chapter written in scars and silence. The doors at the end of the chamber creaked open slowly, and for a brief moment, a shaft of golden afternoon light cut across the threshold. Jasmine stepped into it, not pausing, not looking back. In that light, her figure was more than a silhouette, it was a statement. She had come to drag the truth into the daylight, and now even the walls felt different. No one followed her. No one moved. Because when justice finally speaks not through a verdict, not through punishment, but through revelation, it doesn't end with applause. It ends with stillness. And in that stillness, the weight of what they had all just witnessed settled in like dust over a battlefield. Jasmine didn't need to say another word. She had already said everything. And the truth? It was no longer a document. It had a name, a face, a voice, and it had finally been heard. The door had closed behind Jasmine Crockett hours ago, but the air inside the Capitol still hadn't settled. It was the kind of silence that didn't end when the noise stopped, the kind that hummed beneath the surface, vibrating under marble floors and behind sealed office doors like pressure building beneath a fault line. Outside, the sun had gone down. Inside, Washington had not slept. In the aftermath of the hearing, Trump convened a private war room meeting, not with campaign advisors or policy strategists, but with crisis managers and legal pit bulls. The room was full, but the mood was fractured. Staffers were pale, aides were tight-lipped, and nobody made eye contact unless absolutely necessary. Trump stood at the head of the table, hands clenched against the edge, knuckles bone white. He wasn't yelling yet, but he was close. They think they can pull this shit on me? They think one little girl can blow up my whole career? He growled, voice low, jagged. He didn't wait for an answer. She's not a victim. She's a plant. It's a goddamn performance. Silence. He slammed a binder shut. Pages fluttered to the floor. I want her investigated, all of it. I want Crockett torn open. Bank records, communications, donors. I want to know who put her up to this. Find the leak. Find the money. Burn it all. No one in the room questioned the command, but something had changed. They were slower, less reactive. A few nodded too quickly. Others pretended to jot notes that had no ink. The control Trump once had, the total, unspoken authority that made every room bend to his will, was flickering. The DNA threat hadn't gone public. Yet. But the people in this room weren't stupid. They'd seen the look on his face when the girl had entered. They saw the color drain, the mask slip. And they'd seen something else too. He didn't deny it. Not in real time. Not when it mattered. One aide finally spoke cautiously. "Sir, if we escalate, if we push a counter-narrative before the media gets involved, we risk exposure. If they release any kind of test, they won't," Trump snapped. "She's bluffing." Another voice chimed in, slower, softer. "But if she's not," behind closed doors, panic began to take new shapes. Some GOP leaders started skipping internal briefings. Others, once fiercely loyal, requested to be briefed remotely or through legal intermediaries. No one wanted their fingerprints near this mess. No one wanted to say it out loud, but they were all thinking it. If there is a DNA test, and it's real, then we are looking at the beginning of the end. Back-channel communications between Republican offices grew vague. Some didn't respond at all. Key committee members quietly asked staffers to scrub upcoming schedules, just in case. Lobbyists postponed fundraisers. Major donors, typically glued to Trump's side, began using phrases like "wait and see," monitoring the situation, and reassessing long-term strategy. And Trump? He kept talking louder, angrier, but fewer people were really listening. He doubled down in private, told his comms team to prep a witch hunt message if it ever leaked. He floated trial balloons about calling Jasmine a rogue operative of the deep state and described Alina as an actress with no record. He talked in loops, ranted about the FBI, demanded to know why none of the networks were reporting it, then snapped at his team when he was reminded. There was nothing to report yet. No press release, no public statement. That's because Jasmine Crockett had said nothing. Not a tweet, not a quote, not a whisper. Reporters began circling like hawks, of course. A few had caught wind that something big had gone down in the classified session. Some staffers gave half answers. It was intense, emotional testimony, not ready to comment, but nobody leaked, no images surfaced, no audio, no documents, no names. And still, Jasmine remained silent. Her staff begged her to go public. "You can take control of the narrative," one aide said. "We can get ahead of this. Frame it on your terms." Jasmine shook her head. "She doesn't want this turned into a circus," she said simply. "Who?" Jasmine didn't answer. She didn't have to. Everyone in her office knew exactly who she meant. Alina, the young woman whose life had been defined by silence, who had finally stepped into the light, and who Jasmine had promised to protect from the kind of media storm that devours girls and spits them out as hashtags. Jasmine had made a choice. The truth had spoken, and now it needed room to breathe. "We wait," she said. "Let them sweat." And they did. Inside the Capitol, the atmosphere changed. People smiled differently, walked faster in hallways, looked over their shoulders before speaking. Even those who weren't in the room during the hearing had heard whispers, and those whispers had teeth. "What happened in there? You think it's real? Did he really not deny it?" The uncertainty was worse than a scandal. It was the prelude, the moment before a leak, the second before a strike. No one could predict when or how the wave would break, but everyone could feel the pull of it. At one high-profile fundraiser, a top donor asked Trump's campaign manager if they were prepared for the Jasmine problem. The manager forced a smile. "We're handling it." But his hand was shaking as he reached for his drink. Elsewhere, conservative talk show hosts privately asked producers to prepare two sets of scripts, one if the story stayed quiet, and another if it blew up. Editors at major outlets began setting up Epstein-Trump-Jasmine monitoring alerts. Newsrooms prepared pre-drafted articles just in case. And through it all, Jasmine said nothing. Not out of fear. Not because she didn't have more, but because she understood something Washington had forgotten. The longer power holds its breath, the louder the explosion when it exhales. She wasn't baiting a headline. She was holding a line. Alina had asked for privacy, and Jasmine honored it like it was law. She didn't need validation from cable news. She didn't need applause. The truth didn't need to trend, it just needed to settle, to root itself into the public conscience, so that when the world finally found out, they would believe her, not because it was breaking news, but because it had always been true. The city had gone cold again. It wasn't the weather, it was the waiting. Washington moved fast, But when the truth got too close to power, everything slowed. Not out of laziness, but fear. For weeks, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. Alina said nothing. Trump's team threw out distractions like confetti, but nothing landed. Nothing stuck. And underneath all the silence, everyone knew the real storm hadn't come yet. Then one Monday morning, quiet, gray, humming with tension, a courier dropped a small envelope at Jasmine's office. No name, no address, no seal. It looked ordinary, harmless, but Jasmine's breath caught when she saw it. There was something in the air around that envelope, something final, something tired. She took it into her private office, closed the door, and sat down with both hands on the desk, not touching it, just staring. For a few long minutes, she didn't move. She'd seen all kinds of letters in her life, threats, lies, desperate pleas. But this wasn't that. She could feel it. It didn't scream. It didn't beg. It simply waited to be opened. Finally, Jasmine reached for the envelope, slowly tore it open along the edge, and pulled out a single piece of paper. No header, no legal jargon. Just one line, clean, centered, brutally simple. Tell her I'm sorry, but I can't be public. No name, no initials. But she knew who it was from, and more importantly, she knew what it meant. He was admitting it quietly, cowardly, through a middleman. No court, no hearing, no lights. But that one line was a confession all the same. The man who had haunted Alina's life like a shadow finally spoke. Not to her, not with dignity, but enough to prove everything Jasmine had fought to expose was real, true, and now irreversibly documented. Jasmine's hands trembled, not from shock, but from the weight of restraint. She could take this public. She could end careers with this letter. She could torch every last defense the man had left. But she didn't, because it wasn't her decision to make. This story, this wound, didn't belong to her. It belonged to a young woman who never asked to be born into the silence of other people's sins. A girl who had stood in a room full of power, declared her truth, and walked away with dignity even when the man she named refused to face her. Jasmine folded the letter with trembling care and tucked it into a locked drawer. She didn't call the press. She didn't leak it to Congress. She simply sat there, breathing. Later that day, she made a stop. No entourage, no statement. Just her, a single manila folder, and a brown paper-wrapped frame tucked under one arm. She drove herself across town in a plain black car, windows cracked just enough to feel the fall air press against her skin. When she arrived, Alina was waiting by the window. Her back was straight, her hands folded in her lap. There was an eerie calm about her, like someone who had learned to exist in silence so long, she stopped expecting noise. Jasmine entered quietly, placed the folder on the table, and sat down across from her. She didn't say a word. Instead, she unwrapped the frame and gently slid it toward the girl. Inside the frame was a photograph, old, soft, slightly faded. A mother in her 20s, exhausted but smiling, holding a baby with sleepy eyes and wild black curls. No filters, no posing, just life, captured in the kind of unguarded moment that only comes when no one's looking. Alina stared at it in silence. Her eyes flicked from corner to corner, taking in every crease, every line, every truth. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jasmine leaned forward and whispered, "You never needed him to complete your story. That was it. No grand speech, no breakdown. Just truth, pure and direct." Jasmine didn't mention the letter. She didn't need to. It would only reopen a wound that had started to close on its own terms. Alina didn't cry. She didn't nod. She simply stared at the photo, her hands trembling slightly around the frame. Then she took a long, steady breath, the kind of breath someone takes after surfacing from years underwater. Her silence was stronger than any scream, her dignity louder than any headline. Because in that moment, for the first time in her life, she wasn't a mystery. She wasn't a question. She wasn't a secret whispered behind doors. She was enough. And Jasmine, sitting across from her, didn't try to fix the silence. She honored it, let it live. Outside the window, the sun shifted behind clouds, casting a soft gold light across the floor. A metaphor, perhaps, but Jasmine didn't need metaphors anymore. The moment spoke for itself. In her chest, she felt something powerful move. Not triumph, not justice, something deeper. The kind of closure you don't get from a verdict or a press release, the kind you only get when someone's pain finally finds stillness. This wasn't the end of a fight. It was the beginning of peace. It started with one envelope. No fanfare. No logo. Just a thin, slightly wrinkled envelope slipped through the mail slot like any other. Jasmine noticed it because it was handwritten. Careful, nervous cursive, not typed like the dozens of official memos and legal notices that crossed her desk daily. She had just returned from a late meeting, her body sore, her voice hoarse, her mind still heavy from the hearing that had shaken the walls of Congress. She might have ignored it if not for the small initials in the corner. Just 3 letters. MC. No one on her staff knew who that was, but Jasmine did. She tore the envelope gently, as if it might fall apart. Inside, a single page, no return address, no full name. The letter didn't begin with "Dear Jasmine" or end with "Sincerely." It wasn't about protocol. It was about pain. The handwriting trembled across the paper in dark blue ink. "Thank you. Because of you, I no longer feel like the one who was wrong." That was it. One sentence. One exhale after decades of suffocating silence. Jasmine sat there, unable to move, gripping the paper like it was something sacred. It was. She knew this wasn't just a thank you. It was a confession and a release. Someone, somewhere, had watched what happened in that hearing room, had seen Alina Cortez walk into history and speak a truth the world had tried to bury. And in that moment, she too had begun to heal. The next morning, 3 more letters arrived. By the end of the week, Jasmine had 17. They came from New Jersey, Oklahoma, Sacramento, and places that didn't even show up on most maps. Some were typed and printed. Most were handwritten. One was on lined notebook paper, with tear stains dried into the corner. Each one different in detail, but identical in essence. Women who had buried their truth so long, they had forgotten how to even name it. They weren't writing to press charges. They weren't asking for lawsuits or limelight. They were writing because Jasmine had done the one thing they were never allowed to do. She believed someone, and she let that belief stand not in private, but in a room full of power, under oath, under pressure, against a name that had towered over justice for decades. She never raised her voice. She never begged. She just held the line. Letter after letter echoed the same sentiment. "Thank you. Because of you, we no longer feel like we were the mistake. I didn't think anyone would ever call it what it was. For the first time, I slept without guilt." Some included stories, horrifying, personal, bare. One described a hotel room in 1999, another, a staircase in a private estate no one had dared speak of for years. A woman in her 60s wrote of a party in Palm Beach, her voice now rasped by cancer, her name long buried in NDAs and threats. "I'm too old to fight," she wrote, "but watching that girl stand, I remembered the girl I used to be." Jasmine read every letter in full, never skimmed, never rushed. She cried with some, sat in silence with others. She didn't archive them with legal files. Instead, she bought a cedar wood box, lined it with felt, and placed each letter inside one by one, her hands almost trembling at the weight of invisible history. And still, she said nothing. She didn't go on TV, didn't write an op-ed, didn't tweet. When asked by a reporter outside her office if she had any comment on the national response to the DNA bomb, she simply shook her head and walked past. Because this was never about the media. This was never about her. The truth wasn't a headline. It was a wound, and healing wasn't loud. But the world noticed anyway. Slowly, her name began to circulate in spaces that had long existed in the margins. Shelters, women's legal clinics, counseling centers where trauma wasn't a theory, but a daily reality. At first, it was whispers. "Did you see what she did? The way she stood? She didn't flinch. She didn't back down." Then came the phone calls. Victims' rights organizations, pro bono legal groups, survivor networks. They weren't asking her to be a spokesperson. They were asking her to be a compass. Not because she was famous, but because she was fearless. Because she didn't make the pain about her, because she didn't take credit, because she had, in the darkest room, held the hand of a girl trembling with truth and simply said, "I believe you." One organization in Seattle made her their honorary chair without asking. Another in Georgia began using her cross-examination as training footage for new advocates. A survivor-led fund in Michigan renamed their community library the Crockett Room. And yet Jasmine still refused to speak to the press. She wasn't hiding. She was choosing. Let the noise eat itself, she thought. Let the circus burn out on its own. What mattered now was not the applause, but the aftermath. Not the verdict, but the echo. And the echo was real. One afternoon, her staff found her in her office, not at her desk, but seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by letters. Some open, some unread, some folded with corners soft from overhandling. She didn't notice they were watching. She was too busy holding a note that simply said, "I've never said his name out loud, but last night I did. I said it, and it didn't kill me." Jasmine pressed the letter to her chest, closed her eyes, and breathed. This was not about vengeance. This was not about destroying a man. This was about building something new, one odd truth at a time. In a world that had taught these women that silence was safer than truth, Jasmine Crockett had become the opposite of silence. Not with rage, not with fury, but with steadiness, with patience, with integrity. She hadn't raised her fist. She had opened a door, and one by one, across the country, women were walking through. Not to fight, but finally to live. The air inside the glass-paneled conference hall was still, unnaturally so, like the world had momentarily held its breath. Jasmine Crockett stood alone at the center of the stage at the International Law and Human Dignity Summit. There were no flashing cameras, no roaring applause, only the quiet weight of 1,000 eyes watching a woman who had carried truth through fire and never dropped it. Delegates from across the globe sat in rows of oak-backed chairs, the emblems of justice stitched onto their coats, but none of them spoke. Jasmine wore black not out of mourning, but out of clarity. In her hand, she held no script, no talking points, only a weathered folder marked with creases from being opened and closed too many times. Inside were the handwritten letters from victims who had found their voices after 2 decades of silence. She approached the podium, not with grandeur, but with something heavier grace earned in battle. The only sound in the room was the soft click of her heels across the marble floor. When she finally looked up, her eyes didn't search for approval, they carried fire, and they aimed for the conscience of the world. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried like a storm breaking over still water. "One day," Jasmine began, her tone calm and measured, "the world will remember what powerful men tried to hide." There was no need to name him. Everyone in that room, from Sweden to South Africa, knew who he was. The room didn't shift, it froze. Delegates leaned in, not out of curiosity, but out of duty. What they were hearing wasn't political, it was historical. Jasmine let her words hang in the air for a moment before continuing, her eyes sweeping across the room. "But I hope they remember more than that," she said, her voice firmer now, sharpened by conviction. "I hope they remember the ones who were no longer afraid to speak." A low murmur started to rise from the back rows, not of dissent but of realization. Jasmine took her time stepping back from the podium. She didn't linger for applause. There was none. Not because the room didn't feel it, but because no sound felt appropriate after that. In silence, they honored her. In silence, they understood. As she descended the steps, a woman from the Kenyan delegation stood up quietly and placed her hand over her heart. Others followed one by one until the entire summit stood, not in ceremony but in solidarity. They weren't saluting Jasmine. They were saluting the stories she carried, the ones buried, dismissed, erased. In that moment, justice wasn't a courtroom. It was a room full of people choosing to remember what the world tried to forget. And Jasmine, once silenced, was now the voice that couldn't be unspoken. Outside the summit hall, the press remained locked out. No headlines captured what had just happened. No trending tags. No live broadcasts. But inside shelters, clinics, classrooms, news began to spread. It wasn't about scandal. It wasn't about Trump anymore. It was about Alina. It was about the 12 others. It was about the girl in Detroit, the woman in El Paso, The survivor in Baltimore who finally looked in the mirror and said, "It wasn't my fault." Jasmine had not destroyed a man, she had revived a movement. And that, quietly, was how the ground began to shift. Across the country, organizations that had once begged for funding now found donors flooding in. Community centers began hosting survivor-led panels. Judges who had once rolled their eyes at hearsay now sat longer, listened harder. And through it all, Jasmine refused interviews. She didn't want her face on magazine covers or her name etched into awards. The real victory wasn't about recognition, it was about restoration. And so, while others tried to spin the narrative, Jasmine kept doing the quiet work, replying to letters, mentoring young advocates, reviewing legal briefs for cases long ignored. She became not a martyr, not a celebrity, but something more lasting, a symbol of what happens when one woman refuses to sit down just because the room tells her she doesn't belong. In backrooms of power, the conversation began to change. Lawmakers started asking different questions about statute of limitations, about evidence preservation, about what it truly means to listen. Some fought back, of course. They always do. But their voices cracked now, under the weight of public reckoning. In one private Senate meeting, a congressman was heard saying, "It's too late to shut her down. She didn't just open the door, she burned the damn hinges off." The irony, Jasmine never raised her voice. She didn't shout. She didn't demand vengeance. She demanded truth, and that terrified them more than any protest ever could. And then, something remarkable happened. Alina, once terrified to even speak her name in public, enrolled in law school. She didn't do it for revenge. She did it to build something. She said she wanted to be the kind of advocate Jasmine had been for her. Her first day, she carried a worn-out briefcase, Jasmine's old one, given to her with no ceremony, just a quiet hug and one sentence. "Make it yours." Survivors across the country started their own initiatives, not to shame their past, but to reclaim them. And in doing so, they reshaped the meaning of justice not as a verdict, but as a voice. Years from now, textbooks wouldn't start with Donald Trump. They'd start with Jasmine Crockett at the summit, with that one line that refused to fade: "I hope they remember the ones who were no longer afraid to speak." That's how legacies work, not in statues, not in scandals, but in the echo of courage passed from one soul to another until the silence itself becomes too loud to bear. And as for Jasmine, she never wrote a memoir. She didn't need to. The world had already begun writing it for her. And even as Jasmine Crockett walked off that international stage, the echo of her final words clung to the air like smoke from a long-awaited fire. Her silhouette vanished behind the velvet curtain, but the silence she left behind said everything. People didn't just applaud, they stood in stunned reverence. Not because a scandal had been exposed, but because a soul had spoken without fear. Jasmine hadn't come to tear down a man. She came to lift up the forgotten. And that, in the end, was what shook the world more than any courtroom drama. In the corridors of power, whispers turned to confessions. In homes across America, parents sat a little longer with their children. Teachers started listening more closely. And survivors once shamed into silence began writing letters again, not of anger, but of awakening. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something had cracked, and through that fracture, light began to pour in. The human lesson at the core of Jasmine's journey was not about revenge, it was about recognition. Too often, we wait for the system to validate suffering, to label it legitimate, to give it permission to exist. But Jasmine reminded us that truth doesn't beg for entry, it demands it. Her refusal to respond with rage when mocked, her insistence on facts over fury, her strength in stillness, those were not signs of weakness. They were the armor of a woman who had learned that justice isn't a podium or a hashtag. It's a decision to keep standing even when they try to bury your voice under laughter and condescension. And it's that decision, not the DNA test, not the hearings, that makes Jasmine a hero in a country desperately searching for one. More than anything, Jasmine's story teaches us that you don't need a title to make history. You don't need a badge or a gavel to restore dignity. All you need is the willingness to walk into a room full of people who want you silent and speak anyway. Jasmine's silence, when she chose it, was just as powerful as her words. That moment she stood up, said nothing, and simply handed Alina a framed photo that was healing in action. That wasn't politics. That was humanity. She reminded us that justice doesn't always come in the form of a verdict. Sometimes it arrives quietly through a whisper, through a framed picture, through a young woman finally calling herself whole. But what truly stayed with the world long after the headlines faded was Jasmine's insistence on dignity over destruction. In a world addicted to takedowns, she chose to build something. She built a space where victims could become survivors, where silence could turn into strength. And she didn't do it through sensationalism or self-promotion. She did it by showing up over and over, with courage in one hand and compassion in the other. Her legacy was not a name on a building, it was 1,000 untold stories finally being told. She taught us that truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be given the room to breathe. For the generation watching her, young women, young men, especially those who had ever been told you're making it up, Jasmine became proof that being dismissed does not mean being wrong. She became the embodiment of a new kind of power, not the kind that flexes in front of cameras, but the kind that listens when no one else will. She walked into a room built to humiliate her and left it with the moral high ground. And in doing so, she planted something not loud, not dramatic, but enduring. A belief that integrity still matters, that resilience still wins, that you don't need to destroy your enemies, you just need to outlast their lies. What's perhaps most striking is that Jasmine never set out to be a symbol. She didn't wake up wanting to lead a movement. She wanted answers. And because she refused to stop asking questions, the world started questioning itself. Why did it take 20 years for a girl named Alina to find her father's name? Why were there a dozen letters from survivors with stories no one believed? Why were the systems built to protect the vulnerable always so eager to protect the powerful instead? These were not abstract questions. They were mirrors, and Jasmine held them up until we had no choice but to look. And here lies the heart of the story. Jasmine didn't fight to win a case, she fought to restore a face, a name, a voice. The moment she uttered, she doesn't want compensation, she doesn't want revenge, she only wanted to know the truth, the entire case shifted from legality to legacy. She showed that even in a world obsessed with outcomes, the journey to reclaim one's voice is the real triumph. Jasmine didn't walk out of that hearing with a trophy. She walked out with something greater, the gratitude of those who had no voice, and the quiet knowledge that she had cracked the silence. So what's the message? The one thing we carry with us after this story ends. It's this: truth is not fragile. It doesn't die when ignored. It waits. And when the right person arrives, someone brave enough to open the file, to ask the hard questions, to endure the ridicule, it explodes. Jasmine Crockett wasn't the explosion. She was the spark. And for everyone who ever whispered, "I was there too," she became a torch, a steady flame in a dark room, reminding us all that justice delayed is not justice denied, and silence does not mean consent. You just have to be brave enough to light the match. The final words of Jasmine's speech echoed in every corner of the auditorium, not with thunder, but with quiet certainty. But I hope they remember more about the ones who were no longer afraid to speak. Those words didn't die when the lights dimmed. They stayed behind, in the hearts of those who'd watched, those who'd listened, and those who had once been silent. And as the world watched her disappear down that hallway, head held high, it became clear. This wasn't just the ending of a confrontation. It was the beginning of a movement. A line had been drawn not in policy, but in people. Jasmine's stand didn't just call out power. It dared each of us to confront the power we protect in silence. Her legacy isn't a headline. It's a mirror. And now it's on every one of us to face what we see in it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Injustice doesn't need permission to exist. It thrives in our hesitation. For too long, we've waited for heroes, for leaders, for someone louder, smarter, or stronger to handle the fight. But Jasmine Crockett didn't wait. She walked into a locked room with a single envelope and rewrote the temperature of history. She didn't bring noise. She brought facts. She didn't bring anger. She brought focus. And she didn't bring fear. She brought legacy. That kind of bravery isn't reserved for congresswomen or lawyers. It belongs to teachers, parents, students, nurses, neighbors. It belongs to you. The question is, what will you do with it? Start by refusing to be indifferent. The next time someone shrugs off a survivor's story, you say, I believe her. When someone jokes about assault, you don't laugh, you hold the line. When a politician dismisses abuse as rumor or revenge, you ask them, what if it were your daughter? Speak the names others buried. Question what others protect. Call out the silence that still sounds like complicity. Not for applause, not for politics, but for people. Jasmine didn't dismantle a system in one day, but she lit a match in a room full of cold shoulders, and that spark is still burning. Let it guide you. And don't just talk, act. Donate to shelters. Write to your lawmakers. Volunteer your time where silence is most dangerous. If you lead a company, make your workplace safe. If you're a coach, change the locker room culture. If you're a parent, teach your sons what respect really looks like, not just when someone's watching. Jasmine didn't ask for perfect allies. She asked for real ones. Ones who don't disappear when the headlines fade. Ones who stay even when it's messy. If you think you're too small to matter, ask yourself how one voice just changed the trajectory of one of the most powerful men in the world. But this story isn't just about accountability. It's about restoration, about dignity returned to those who were made to feel disposable. When the 12 letters arrived at Jasmine's office, they weren't filled with rage. They were filled with relief. Because of you, we no longer feel like we were the ones who did something wrong. That sentence doesn't need a microphone. It needs a ripple, and you can be it. You who watched and felt something shift inside. You who remembered a moment in your life when you wished someone had stood for you. Now it's your turn. Stand for them. Understand this. Trauma doesn't live on a timeline. It doesn't care if 20 years have passed. It doesn't end with one DNA match or one apology. It ends when a society decides it's no longer okay to pretend it didn't happen. That begins with education, with men teaching other men that power is not a pass, with women backing each other instead of tearing each other down, with communities building spaces where justice isn't feared, it's expected. Jasmine didn't just challenge a man, she challenged America's memory, and memory, once awakened, cannot go back to sleep. So when you're asked what this moment meant, don't say it was powerful. Say it changed what I expect from myself. Don't wait for another hearing. Don't wait for a perfect storm. Be the thunder. Be the one who names names when no one else will. Be the one who refuses to sit down. And if they tell you you don't belong here, remember Jasmine's words. I'm not here to belong. I'm here to make sure someone else finally does. Carry that into every room you enter, into every conversation, into every vote, into every silence you have the power to break. Because one truth, courageously spoken, can outlive an empire built on fear. That's what Jasmine taught us. And that's what we owe to the Alinas of the world, still waiting to know they are not alone. You may never walk into Congress. You may never hold an envelope that burns history into daylight. But you hold something just as powerful, your choice. To speak, to act, to never again look away. That's how justice grows. Not in courtrooms, in living rooms, in classrooms, in whispers that become voices, in shame that becomes strength, in pain that becomes purpose. So here's your call. Don't honor Jasmine with applause. Honor her with action. Ask yourself what silence you've accepted, what truth you've delayed, what voice you've ignored. Then do something about it. Because stories like this weren't written to entertain, they were written to awaken. And if you've come this far, you're already awake. Now stay loud, stay bold, and above all, stay human. But if this moment is truly going to mean something, it has to last longer than 24 hours. Movements die when memories fade. That's how they silence the next Alina. That's how injustice wins, not with a bang, but with our forgetting. So write her name down. Not Jasmine's, you already know hers. Write the name of the girl you knew, the one who never told you why she cried in the bathroom, the coworker who flinched when someone touched her shoulder, the niece who grew up too fast. Don't erase them with time. Remember them with purpose. And then act like you were put here to make sure no one has to walk through what they did. Jasmine didn't need a badge or a title or an army. She needed conviction. And when she stood alone in that sealed room, surrounded by power and mockery, She didn't flinch. Because the truth doesn't care about titles. It only asks, will you carry me? Most won't. It's easier to look away, easier to say that's not my fight. But Jasmine knew something we all forget. Silence is expensive. It costs people their peace. It costs girls their futures. It costs survivors their names. So if you still think staying quiet is safe, ask yourself, safe for who? Let this story haunt you not with pain, but with duty. Let it sit with you the next time you hear a dismissive joke. Let it echo the next time you hear a victim's voice being doubted. Let it live in the silence that falls when someone finally says, it happened to me too. Because if Jasmine could walk into a room built to erase her and still speak, you can speak too. You can listen. You can believe. You can hold the line. That's not politics. That's humanity. And if we lose that, we lose everything. So here's the last word. This story isn't over. Not because of the scandal, not because of the DNA, but because the world has just remembered what courage looks like. And now the world is watching you. And when the world watches, don't look away. History isn't just written by those in power. It's rewritten every time someone chooses conscience over comfort. The next story won't begin in Congress or on camera. It will begin in a classroom, in a living room, in a board meeting where someone finally says, that's not right. That's where the legacy continues, in small acts of defiance that ripple into justice. Because silence doesn't protect peace, it protects the powerful. So carry her fire not as anger, but as clarity. Carry it until you see change in the mirror, in the laws, in the way we treat each other. Jasmine spoke once, but the echo belongs to all of us now. And when your voice trembles, remember hers didn't, and speak anyway. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.